I'd like to introduce Denise Stanley of Clock Your Skills, connected with the Academy of Contemporary Music in London, also connected with Middlesex University, but she'll be focusing on this notion of Clock Your Skills, which is a great way to track skills and knowledge in parallel in industry and in education, and mapping between frameworks. Very exciting project. Take it away.
So it's a great privilege to be here and to talk with you all about the CLOC programme. The CLOC programme has been really informed by 40 years of practice. And that practice has been in education, in industry, and in community learning spaces. And so just to give you a bit of background, so you can understand how CLOC has been influenced by this process. I myself am someone who was the first person in my family to go to university. I grew up in a home where we had one room with heating, we had no books, and if someone came to see us, the television volume went up. If there hadn't have been a library at the end of my road, a small library, the sort of library that governments will cut because it's small, I would not be on this platform. Nor would I have a PhD, an MBA, a postgraduate certificate in architecture, and a first-class BSc honours, because of that small library. When I got my first-class honours, my mother did not know what it meant. "Is that good?" she said. When we're thinking about inclusion, we need to understand that people who need inclusion do not come from a context anything like traditional, formally educated students. And as much money is pumped into widening participation and access budgets, do not reach where those young people need to be reached. When I got my PhD, the first thing I did was to write doctor on my bus pass, because it gave me, I don't know what, but it felt I was differentiated, and even when my mother died, she still didn't know what I did. So I want to start there because this is a personal journey for me. This is based on a value system which is around giving people the opportunity to develop in a number of different ways. Formal education does not suit all people. I have worked for 30 years in a community learning programme where I trained black music managers by setting up a record label. So I'm going to start and hope get the slides in the right order, press the right button, which I'm hoping is this one, but we'll see. So I am currently working as head of knowledge exchange for a very small independent creative university, which has 3 campuses in London, in Birmingham and in Guildford. And we'll see if this works. This is my image of formal education. It's from the 1980s, and it's a slot machine where pennies get dropped through, go onto moving stairs, and then, if you're lucky, get pushed into the tray at the bottom. What happens, though, is every so often a big bar comes across and pushes all the pennies that are so-called stuck over to the side, away from the winning tray and out of the game. That is our level 3 qualifications and our level 6 qualifications. And the stuck pennies are those who don't fit formal education at that point. So I wanted to say that formal education is structured for us to lose. if we don't have middle-class parents, if we don't have a good teacher that wants to spend the time to help us develop, we can get through level 2 absolutely fine on our own. But you try getting through a level 3 qualification with no support. It is not possible to achieve what you're capable of without that background. And state schools and public schools are too busy. And that hasn't changed over decades. So if we face the facts, education is an outmoded division of labour model that has put glass ceilings in at level 3 and level 6. My job within CLOC is to smash those 2 glass ceilings. So, just think for a minute. Do you know any people that left school with low or no formal qualifications, yet have acquired deep and broad sector insight, knowledge and skills through work, through being involved in a faith community or their local neighbourhood community or just their life skills? And have these same people been passed over as a graduate takes the achieved for the job, or they've been denied progression opportunities because they don't have formal certification for what they know, or they're outside the traditional culture of that company and don't have access to the social networks that you gain in a university. And those people are different. They may have a second language. They may have social, economic, health. They may be young carers with alcoholic parents or sick parents. They may themselves have disabilities, but they all have barriers. Just make sure it's the right slide. So, let's move on then. Can you imagine, and I often have, a level playing field for all adults across the world, created by recognising and validating their achievements at any age and in any field, irrespective of how, when and where they acquired that knowledge and skills? Imagine the same higher education award gained in an industry sector community rather than an academic community, but meeting exactly the same learning outcomes with rigour at the same level, but in a completely different context. I took personally the EU 2012 directive. Every citizen has the right to have their learning recognised and validated, irrespective of the context in which that learning occurred. That is written on my heart, because that is social justice when 70% of Europeans do not go to university, cannot show the formal certification. So, fast forward, that was the premise for setting up the CLOC programme. I want to introduce you to some people now. And it's a transnational programme that works for recognition, validation and certification. It began in Europe. So there's Frank. He's a Caribbean man. He left school aged 12 with no secondary education at all. It's a Canadian woman called Hannah with a PhD in cultural heritage. There's an English disabled woman who's called Debbie, who's a care leaver, and she's an established creative pioneer. There's a Spanish woman, Maribel, who's a community educator in a public library in the Netherlands. There's a Hungarian man called János. He's a broadcaster and runs media training in a co-working space. Then there's a Caribbean woman, Paulette, who's got an OBE for services to music publishing in the UK and no formal qualifications. There's a Caribbean woman called Michelle, who's an Ivor Novello songwriter. She's won awards, the Brit Award. She has no qualifications, but she runs a session in her lounge to support new talent. There's a guy called Steve, an Englishman who co-founded a global music company for research and training that works across the world, training social media training for the creative industries. There's a Scottish woman called Lynn, who is an executive coach and a volunteer mentor in the cultural sector. And then there's a woman in front of you called Denise, who's the English woman with a low socio-economic class, but had a fully funded education, which is why she's standing here. All of these people got the same qualification in the same way, based on what they do now, not based on any narrative, not based on any language register, but showing what they can do now, reflecting on it, and engaging in a peer review discussion in a community of practice. So, one of the reasons I've taken the work at ACM as a small independent university is it's agile. And it's very common for recognition of prior learning to make a bridge into higher education. But it's very rare to see one out where people at level 4 who are failing, who cannot manage the formal curriculum, to then be able to go out and working in industry and continue their education in industry. A certain young man, who many of you might have heard of, called Ed Sheeran, was at ACM and had to choose between finishing his degree or starting his career, and we all know which one he took. So these are real choices, and the reason I've been able to do this bridging is you can see in the blueprint underneath. I am Denise at Clock Your Skills, but I'm also Dee Stanley at ACM. Therefore, I have the opportunity to join up those worlds that rarely join up. So, a bit about ACM. ACM has the same values as many universities. It says the same things on its website. We aim to be the most inclusive and professionally relevant education provider in the creative industries. The values they have: inclusivity, supportive environment, agility and innovation, connectivity, high professional and academic standards. They're small, they're agile, they can shift, they can innovate, and they've got 3 campuses in different parts of London. They're a great partner for Clock. So they run short courses, if we're going to talk about micro-credentials, but those are based around a 30-credit chunk. They've been working with businesses to serve their needs, tailoring to the training needs of those companies. But one of the things I've done while I've been there is to write a program called Creative Industries Futures. And in the first module of that, everyone on that program in the university gets the opportunity to undertake a professional practice framework. Clock is one of those options. So that means people who do Clock anywhere in the world can get exemption for that module and enter a master's, or just have a postgraduate certificate with 60 credits. And anyone in a university who prefers to work in the workplace in their own commissioned projects can do exactly the same. So that new standalone award is groundbreaking across the world. We had to experiment to get to this part. And in order to do that, I created something called a shell module, which really reminded me of this morning's session when they were talking about an envelope that you could put a credential in. A shell module, you validate the process and the outcome, but not the content. And we slotted industry practice models in to test it like an industry songwriting camp, where students were acting to a professional brief. So students can achieve 60 credits in an independent or collaborative professional context. That was the pilot. And then anyone like Ed Sheeran who was offered professional work could continue to do their level 5 and level 6 studies. So more recently, between 21 and 22 post-COVID, we have integrated aspects of ACM with aspects of CLOC. So you can do situated learning. You can do the authentic process of what it is you're trying to do in your practice. You can build an industry-relevant portfolio. You can bridge to and from an academic program with automatic tariffs already set up on the national credit transfer and pre-negotiated articulation routes. The two elements that are the most powerful in this journey from the point of view of recognition are the professional awards in communities of practice are interchangeable with the academic program. And therefore, there is an automatic articulation for professional awards for people who've actually done the CLOC sector expert. Many of you may not know CLOC in a lot of detail. I'm just going to talk briefly about the process. We mentioned rigour a few times, and I've mentioned it once. But there have been problems. The CLOC framework was designed by industry, employers and contractors. There were no educators involved at all in the process. And we went through a process of 4 stages in the development. The first one is, how do you run a non-formal program and get formal certification without contaminating the non-formal learning? That's been a big one. If you think, here is the process of CLOC, and here are the units I wrote for the Scottish Qualifications Authority. One is just CLOC, the other one is 4 units that will be holistically assessed, which is a direct mirror image of what happens in CLOC. That took me 2 years to work out and do. But that worked effectively. It meant anyone could get these new qualifications, which were a professional development award in the cultural and creative industries at SCQF Level 11, which is EQF Level 7. So that was the first one. The second one I talked about is putting a shell and then changing the content, but the learning outcomes being generic enough to accommodate. And then the bridge, where I talked about us going in both directions. But the postgraduate certificate brings us to the point of using a twin. You do the identical qualification and interchangeable qualification in industry or in university. The same outcomes, the same qualifications, different contexts. That means anyone without any qualifications, like Frank, who left school at 12, if you remember, he can get a postgraduate certificate. He actually was in the early group that got the SQA award, but it was 64 Scottish credits, which is equivalent to 60 English credits. So, CLOC, it just has 3 points that we value. So if we were doing badges, which we are thinking about doing, I looked at badges in 2012, there's an industry entry badge, which means you are work ready but still need supervision. The competent level means we can wind you up and let you go, whether you're doing freelance, employment, or enterprise. An expert means you have enough depth and breadth of practice to mentor and coach others because you have transferred your skills across 8 different contexts. So how does CLOC work? As I said, it's not a narrative. You don't have to write about anything. It's not an essay. It's not research in the traditional sense of the word. I was telling someone earlier that when I was in the validation panel for the SQA award, I said there will be a literature review over my dead body, and then left them in the room for an hour to discuss it. But the point with CLOC is you show the competencies in your everyday work. Oh, you've done an album, here it is. Oh, so you've done a tour, there's the stage plans, there's the budget. It is real stuff. You then reflect on your professional development, having built that portfolio of competencies which are framed by CLOC. And you do something that I haven't seen anywhere else. You reflect on how have your values influenced your career choices. That has a profound impact on people who have always put others before themselves and realised that their values have led them away from their own creative practice and creativity sometimes. Or that they've concentrated on their career and not supported other people. So those three reflective statements of CLOC take people into a place where I say they look at the coat they're wearing that they're used to, that everyone's seen, they dust it down, fold it up, and put on a completely different coat and then shoot off like a rocket to do something that they feel is important. CLOC is an international program. You are peer-reviewed by someone in your sector, in your country, but you are also peer-reviewed by someone in your sector in a different country, which enables the peer reviewers to find out about what the changes are in the territory, but also ensures that that person has mobility for their skills. And then the last stage of CLOC, when you have put everything together and done the peer review, is where you confirm your higher level skills with certification. Guess what? You can't fail, because you have to do it before you register for the qualification. And for people who've spent years failing in formal education, that is one of the most important points. So, CLOC is currently talking about level 8, which is a PhD through practice. And the reason we're doing that is, when I gave up performing, because I was a singer and songwriter and gigging musician, I took up the role of a celebrant. I thought, oh, I'm going to learn to be a celebrant. So, weddings, funerals, naming. And what I learned as a celebrant, that at someone's funeral, they have a tribute which they never hear about how brilliant they are, the legacy they've left to community, to industry. They don't hear it. That is a CLOC PhD. Someone who is an industry champion or a community champion, that 12 people are peer reviewing their practice, just like 12 published peer review papers. So this model creates a level playing field for non-formal learners, who are the ones in orange. It also serves as a rapid recognition of prior learning for education, for articulation, and Middlesex University was mentioned. We had an early articulation agreement with them. But it's also a reliable source of work-based competencies for employers, contractors, and investors. The one thing that is, again, different about the competencies, and I heard it mentioned here, is we have something called developing social potential, and that's building social capital. That's inclusion. That's not externalising costs for the health service to pick up because you're not treating your workers properly. So we've always said that CLOC has made invisible skills visible, but they're also internationally valued. And then my last slide is really just summarising. Actually, no, I did do an extra slide with a few books that I thought people might want to see what kind of reading has led to this process. So the critical knowledge exchange areas where senior academics are working with industry expert practitioners and leaders to be able to create professionally oriented and opportunity-facing and problem-centered learning that is meaningful and carries both the validation of the industry but also of higher education if people want it. And then ACM is very, very fortunate in that Metropolis Studios, which is part of industry, is part of that group. And one of the things that has come out of the relationship between CLOC and ACM is that Metropolis is now working on a programme training London's young unemployed people, pushing the equality, diversity and inclusion agenda. Because you know what? At Metropolis Studios, they have a lot of black artists coming from the US and the UK, and they don't have enough black engineers. And this programme is going to move that agenda forward in practice. So the last slide, you'll just I'll pick out my favourite ones. These are the ones, some of which have been here. So Etienne Wenger, Communities of Practice, I've seen this morning. Paulo Freire, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, has had a massive influence on forum theatre. The one I love, Richard Sennett, The Craftsman. CLOC had its first blacksmith go through the programme. You can't get more embodied practice than a blacksmith. That blacksmith had spent 40 years as a blacksmith and could not train anyone because he had no formal certification. He did CLOC. He now has 100 apprentices at the University of Budapest, keeping that practice alive. So I can give you story after story, but I'll tell you one more. In the Netherlands, they changed the community learning structure to move under formal learning. The hip-hop industry in Holland was working with young people, graffiti artists, dancers, musicians, rappers. All of them were fired. None of them had any qualifications. They then came to CLOC and said, we can't have this happen. You have got to sort this out. All of those people involved in that process are now working as artists and creatives, but also in schools, colleges, and they've got a brilliant scheme called Sick Teachers. And it's sick in the more current version, and it's when teachers are ill at school, artists go in and sit with their class. Sick Teachers. So on that note, the last book I will mention is Neurodiversity at Work. The creative industries is full of divergent thinkers and practitioners, and making room for the whole classroom to be able to work with that openness. No more framing narrow hoops, inclusion, different ways of reasonable adjustments for everyday people. So thanks for listening.
Thanks very much, Denise. That was a corker. We have about 10 minutes for questions, and we've got some roving mics. I will say that I discovered Denise when I was doing a project for the BC government on the convergence of micro-credentials with the recognition of prior learning. And Denise just took it so much further that we simply had to have her here. Quick question as we get ready for other people. You talk about creative industries. What about other industries? Can this be applied to them?
So this is a generic framework that is contextualized by the sector experts. So I tested it, funnily enough, with nuclear physics, health physics, and mental health nursing, because there is this glass ceiling effect for particularly mental health nursing. You get people who join to be mental health assistants who spend 10 years on the ward, cannot be nurses, are not going to fund themselves through 3 years of a degree. CLOC would provide the mechanism where they could move from competent professional to sector expert and then be able to work in a role which actually they're quite competent to do, but cannot show the formal certification. So it works for every sector. It was designed as a generic framework for industry-centered learning.
Any other questions? Because I have one, if nobody has one. How important is a national qualifications framework to what you do? You've mentioned the CQF, the EQF. What about North America?
So, and Australia. We do the
Australia,
AQF, so we're working in Australia.
Yeah.
So I think it's very, very important. I think one of the challenges for higher education is to map its outcomes to those frameworks. Some of the outcomes and the subject benchmarks of higher education aren't quite in the same framing, let's put it that way. But from an EQF point of view, we started with the EQF and we started with 15 countries. And so we were using the EQF, obviously applying to the UK at that point. But I think it's critical to have these benchmark levels, but to make them generic enough to be able to accommodate work, self-employment, project-based learning, project-based work. You know, I think the kind of jobs framing for working life isn't going to work with the next couple of generations coming, because they want more quality and they also want more collaboration. Hello.
Okay, sorry. My name is Beatrice Rouzet. Maybe I didn't hear well, but did you say that a clock is not a SIA? It's not a skill qualification evaluation? Is it or is it not?
Right, so basically what CLOC does, it has 4 skill sets. So in a way it does, but they are scaffolding. So one is called creative practice. So you can put a bracket around creative and use it for another industry. So one is practice. The other one is enterprise. Then we have something called sharing knowledge and skills. And then we have something called developing social potential. We have 2 more frameworks, skill sets that we're working on. One is the green economy, and the other one is what we've called global local citizen, which is about getting people to engage in their local neighbourhood and placemaking, because that's going to support the green. So we're doing those 2 skill sets together as an addition for CLOC. But it is for people primarily who do not have formal qualifications, who've learned through work, through community, through other forms of non-formal learning. And it does exactly what 2012 directive. It makes it visible, recognises it, validates it, and certificates it formally if that person wants that. We're beginning to have industry people go, I just want the industry award, I'm not interested in the formal one. Or I've already got a degree, but it's in a different area, or things like that. Does that help? Yeah.
So I think we have to move on to the next one, but maybe you want to give a plug for the workshop that's happening later today.
Oh, yes. So at 4 o'clock, we have something called a skills discovery workshop that CLOC use internationally, and we've got it in French and in English. And we will be running a taster of that workshop for anyone who wants to discover the skills they didn't know they had. Thank you.
With that, thank you very much.